So much, of course, to be discussed by those NATO member leaders today. I guess one of the key ones will be exactly how to interpret Article 5, the idea that an attack on one is an attack on all. If things continue as they are, focused just in Ukraine, or if they escalate going into other countries, or perhaps more likely, a change of the tactics and weaponry that Russia is using in Ukraine. What do you think NATO members' take on that will be today?
Well, I think it's essential for deterrence that there is a certain ambiguity about the interpretation of Article 5. This is also a reason why I think NATO leaders should not exclude this or that action. In my opinion, they have been too eager to exclude this or that in the event of Russian attacks and change of strategies. We are undermining our own deterrence. If we exclude actions, it provides a room of maneuver for Putin. So that would be my main advice. Don't exclude any action.
And if there's no formal announcements on that point to maintain flexibility, Mr. Rasmussen, today, what do you think internally they will be saying? What would be a possible trigger for military action from NATO? Would it be the use of chemical weapons by Russia in Ukraine?
There are certainly red lines. The use of chemical weapons, biological weapons, not to speak about nuclear weapons, of course. But also when it comes to the definition of red lines, I think we shouldn't be too clear, because that could tempt Mr. Putin to really test our resolve. I think an important decision today would be to pave the way for a permanent stationing of NATO troops in Eastern allied countries, the Baltic states, Poland and Romania, to protect NATO against any Russian attack.
How much stronger are NATO forces, or potentially stronger if those types of steps are taken, than Russian forces in the eventuality, the hypothetical situation where no nuclear weapons were used, just fights, military engagements on the ground in Ukraine? Would NATO forces overwhelm Russian forces with ease?
I think well, first of all, NATO forces are much more efficient, much stronger than the Russian army. We have really seen the Russians fail in their attempts to carry out a blitzkrieg in Ukraine. We have overestimated the strength of the Russian forces. So I have no doubt that if we deploy a substantial number of NATO troops in Eastern allied countries, that would deter Russia. But on the other hand, I think we will need around 100,000 troops permanently stationed or on a regular rotational basis stationed in Eastern countries.
And of course, Mr. Rasmussen, you have a greater insight than any of us on how likely the member states are to take that step. Do you think there is sufficient urgency and unity among NATO members to take it today?
Yeah, I think in principle they will agree to reinforce territorial defense in the East. But equally important will be the subsequent EU summit today, because we have to stop the financing of Putin's war. That could be done if we immediately stop all imports of oil and gas from Russia, and that would take an EU decision.
We've, of course, got the focus on President Biden this particular week, Mr. Rasmussen. But if we were to step back and consider the four presidents of the United States that have been in power during President Putin's tenure leading Russia, do any of them stand out to you to having enabled Putin's overreach more than the others?
I think Putin has changed as a person. When I first met Putin in 2002, Bush was the president in the United States. And actually, Bush and Putin had a very good relationship. And if you look back, Putin was very pro-Western at that time. Then he changed his attitude around, I would say, 2006, 2007. He turned anti-Western. Then President Obama took over, and he tried a reset in our relationship with Russia. I supported that. I think we should reach out to Russia and give them a chance. Then, of course, President Trump was a special example. I think he did a lot of harm to NATO, undermining our credibility, cozying up with Putin, etc. And now we have Biden, who is he's a very committed internationalist. He has really been a driving force in creating Western unity. I appreciate that.
You mentioned there President Putin's pivot or certainly change in tone towards the West, towards the back half of the first decade of the century. One wonders whether NATO expansion contributed to that, rightly or wrongly, the spin he might have applied to what is otherwise a defensive organization back home in Russia, particularly in 2004, 7 nations joined. I bring it up because, of course, many people talking today about whether his invasion of Ukraine might lead to countries like Finland or Sweden to now join NATO. Do you think that that's now likely? And would that potentially make Putin's aversion to the West worse?
I hope Finland and Sweden would join NATO, and I think the two countries, in their self-interest, should use the current window or opportunity to apply for membership, because Putin is preoccupied elsewhere. He can't do anything, and it would be a defeat for Putin to see Finland and Sweden join NATO. But in general, I would say, Russia is not a victim. NATO has the whole way through been a defensive alliance. We are not threatening Russia. We have reached out to Russia on several occasions. So we did the right thing at the right moment, taking on board former communist states in Eastern Europe. And thanks to the decisions in 2002, 2004, they are now well protected by NATO's Article 4. Think about the situation now. If we hadn't taken that decision back then, the Baltic states would now be under threat.
One final question from me, Mr. Rasmussen, just to sum things up. What would you like to see NATO leaders announce today that would turn the tide in this war without creating greater aggression?
Yeah, first of all, permanent stationing in the East. But I think we should cut off all imports of oil and gas. Each and every day, we pour money into Putin's coffers by purchasing oil and gas at very high prices. We have to put an end to this devastating war and do it quickly. It will come at a price, but the price, if the war is dragging on, would be much higher.